Let's take a look at another type of seam repair, hand sewn seam repair stitch. I've got another 9x6 sample here with the gap open. Again, this is 9 inches on grain, 3.5 inches on cross grain, and it is partially sewn. The two pieces of muslin are partially sewn together at the top and the bottom. Seam allowance is then pressed flat on my ironing board, leaving a little bit of a hole just to simulate a torn or ripped seam. I have my needle and thread already threaded, ready to go. Little hand sewing needle. I'm using red thread again, so you can clearly see what stitches I'm doing. The thread is looped at the needle's eye, but I am only using a single length of thread to sew, because again, we want to keep these stitches as inconspicuous as possible. And I have a tiny little knot at the end of my thread there. Just trimming my extra threads. Okay. So this stitch is what I like to refer to as the ladder stitch. This is going to end up looking much more invisible, but it's much harder to do a stitch like this while the garment is still on the wearer. This is something you're more than likely do on a garment or costume that's been taken off of the wearer and is getting repaired on the fly before they have to be changed back into a garment or something. So again, back down here, I'm going to start at the bottom of my piece, and I am again right-handed, so I'm going to be working on the right-hand side of I'm going to start on the right side of my sample. If you're left-handed, you can start on the left side of your sample. Same start as we did with the whip stitch. I'm going to go inside here, right about where the stitching ends, the machine stitching ends, and I'm going to slide my needle through that fold, the rightmost fold of this broken seam. So I'm only going through this fold here. I haven't gone through to the left side of the seam yet. So the needle is just coming through this fold on the rightmost side. And you can see the rest of my needle is there, sandwiched between the garment and the seam allowance. And I'll pull my needle through. And now I've anchored my knot in that fold there. That way you don't see the knot on either side. It's just hiding in between this fold. So I've got my needle, my thread coming through the right-hand side of my garment. Now with the whip stitch, we kind of picked up the entire piece. We slid our needle in between this open gap, and then I picked up everything from the back and front. We went through the entire fold. This is going to be different with the ladder stitch. I'm going to slide my needle into the fold of my leftmost piece, the leftmost fold of my garment. So I've slid my needle through the fold on the left-hand side. Now again, if you're left-handed, you may have pulled your needle through from this side and anchored your knot on this side. Then you would slide your needle through the fold on the rightmost side of this seam. So there's my needle going through the fold. And if I lift this up, you can see the needle hiding right along that fold where the seam would be. So I'm traveling my needle through that fold. Get accustomed to holding your work with your finger behind the fabric. That way you can feel whether you've pierced too far, and ensure that you're just going through the fold of the leftmost side of the seam. Picking up about 1/4 of an inch, I've gone down and back up through the fold. This is about 1/4 inch distance here. I'm going to pull my needle up, pull that thread through. So now that thread is hiding along that fold on the inside of the garment. This is essentially a running stitch, but can be done on a finished garment before, once the seam is already put together. So I've picked up 1/4 inch on the leftmost side, and now I'm going to travel to the right side at the same level as where my thread has just come out. I'm going to travel to the right side of my seam. Again, sliding my needle into and along that fold. So I set my needle into that fold on the right side of my garment. I'm going to travel about 1/4 inch. and send the needle back out. So I'm traveling through that fold. If it helps for you to kind of sandwich fold the fabric up towards you like we did previously, you can do that. Traveling the needle through the rightmost side of the fold, and again, if I lift my sample up there, you can see my needle traveling along that fold. Again, 1/4 inch in and out by about 1/4 inch, and I will pull my needle through. And as I pull, I'm just going to tug on this thread ever so slightly. Don't tug it too hard. You should start to see, you can see how I've got that gap there, but once I pull this thread through, you can see that seam start to close itself up. So now I've got one stitch hiding on my left-hand side, and then I've got another stitch hiding on the right-hand side. I'm going to continue working my way up. And if it helps, here I'll fold my fabric so you can see what I'm doing here. Again, right at the area where I just came out of the rightmost seam, I'm going to go over to the left side, the left-hand fold. Travel my needle through that fold about 1/4 inch. And pull through. Right where my needle came out of the left-hand side, I'm going to go over to my right side. And again, travel my needle in and out through that fold, about 1/4 inch. And again, if I pull this thread, you should see that seam kind of zipper itself back up. Gonna go back to the left-hand side, again around the same level as where my thread came out on the right side. Go through that fold, travel my needle about 1/4 inch, pull it through. And again, where my thread just came out, I'm gonna go over to the right-hand side, the same level. Travel my needle about 1/4 inch. And pull that through. As you pull that thread, you should see that seam zipper itself closed. So I'll continue working my way up. Notice when I'm working, I always keep my fingers underneath here, because if I go too deep with my needle going straight through, I can feel the prick of the needle on my finger, and I know that I'm not traveling in that fold. I shouldn't be able to feel the needle under there if it's sitting inside the fold of the fabric. Okay. Coming to the end of my split in my seam here. Take this last stitch. I'm just going to spread my fabric, make sure it's nice and flat, that it's not bumping up in the middle, that it's not pulled too tight. If you see any gaps or anything like this, give your thread a tug and have it zipper up that seam back for you. And finishing this, you can finish it either on the front or the back of the sample. I'm going to finish mine on the front so you can clearly see what I'm doing. I'm going to do similar to what I did with the whip stitch. I'm going to pick up both folds. So I'm going through the right and left hand side. You can see my needles going through the back. So similar to folding the fabric like this, and then just going through both the right and the left hand side. I'm going to pull that through just to anchor my stitches. And then I'm going to take a tiny little stitch close to where my thread just came out. Just picking up a couple of little fibers with my needle. Pull that through. And before this loop disappears, put my needle through the loop and pull my thread through to create a little knot and trim my thread. Again, you can take that tiny little knot on the inside of the garment if you want the knot to be hidden. It would go on the inside, but for the sake of the sample, you can knot it on the front or the back, inside or outside of the garment, the quote-unquote garment. So that is essentially, it's essentially a running stitch. It should look like a running stitch from the two sides. But rather than have to fold the fabric together and do a running stitch and hope that you are landing your needle in the fold of both sides, you can take each individual stitch on either side of this folded seam allowance and travel your needle through the folds. And that way we end up with a less visible seam, less visible fix. You can't really see much of the stitches from either side. You can see a few of them because I've used such a high contrast thread, but obviously on an actual garment or actual repair, you'd be using similar colored thread, so this would be virtually invisible. Much different compared to the whip stitch. Whip stitch can be faster and can be done on a wearer, whereas this is more of a quick fix if you don't have a sewing machine around and you need to repair a seam after it's come off of a wearer. Make sure to label your samples accordingly. And that is the ladder stitch seam repair all done.